Welcome to Jay Coletti's Racket Reviews. My name is Jay Coletti and I will be your hostess. Here on Racket Reviews, we are dedicated to learning about all things organized crime, and I'm very excited to wrap up our discussion today about the infamous Gambino family in New York. If you haven't had the opportunity already, please make sure to watch part 1 of the Gambino family and parts 1 and 2 of the Genovese family. All of the families are going to be very interconnected, so you want to make sure to get the whole scope of the story from the different perspectives. So please make sure to keep up with the crime family videos, and we have a lot to get to today, so let's get right into it. Following the bloody, tumultuous reign of Albert Anastasia, Carlo Gambino's secretive, quiet demeanor was a much-needed change for the family. Although Frank Costello was the main inspiration for Vito Corleone in The Godfather, it cannot be denied that The Godfather's temperament was inspired by Carlo Gambino, calm, collected, modest, and hated the drug trade. Carlo Gambino was born in Palermo, Sicily on August 24, 1902, to a family that was involved in the Sicilian Mafia. Gambino came to the United States as a stowaway on the day before Christmas Eve, 1921, in Norfolk, Virginia. He would later move to New York to join his cousins, the Castellanos, where he worked for the family's small trucking firm and married his cousin, Catherine Castellano. At the time of the Castellamarese War, Gambino was working under Joe Miseria, but had avoided the conflict for the most part. Following Miseria's death, Carlo Gambino became a soldier in Vincent Mangano's gang, where Albert Anastasia was underboss. Gambino was a great earner in loan sharking, gambling, extortion, and was promoted to the position of capo under Vincent Mangano. It was during this time that Carlo Gambino would successfully be charged the first and only time for a crime. In 1937, he was sentenced to 22 months in prison for tax evasion. Anastasia took over the family in 1951 and would be the boss until 1957. At the time of Anastasia's murder, Gambino had been promoted to underboss. Carlo Gambino worked with Vito Genovese to overthrow the bosses of their respective families to take control for themselves. Frank Costello and Albert Anastasia were allies, and Genovese knew that he could not take out one without taking out the other. This is when Carlo Gambino saw his opportunity to seize power. Gambino, along with Meyer Lansky, agreed to work with Genovese to get rid of Albert Anastasia. The attempt on Frank Costello's life was made by Vincent Gigante, who would later become boss of the Genovese family, on May 7, 1957. Later that year, Gambino had contracted the job to kill Anastasia out to Joseph, Crazy Joe Gallo, and Carmine the Snake Persico, when their boss, Joe Profaci, the original head of the now Colombo family, had also joined this coup d'etat and offered the two men services to Gambino and Genovese. The Genovese-Gambino alliance was by no means the beginning of a wonderful friendship. Genovese believed that Carlo Gambino was indebted to him after he had played a critical role in establishing him as boss. Carlo Gambino did not feel the same way. After taking over as boss, he aligned himself with Frank Costello, Lucky Luciano, and Meyer Lansky against Vito Genovese. After the Appalachian meeting in 1957, where allegedly Vito Genovese was to be named boss of bosses but was arrested instead, Carlo Gambino would end up taking over as the head of the commission. In the early 1960s, Don Gambino was still busy fighting off the remainder of the Anastasia loyalists, but thanks to his top capos, Agnello della Croce, Paul Castellano, Carmine Lombardozzi, Joseph Armoni, and Carmine Fatico, he was able to maintain his power, and the Anastasia loyalists were unable to move against him. As boss, Gambino spread his influence across the entire country, including New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, Miami, Boston, San Francisco, and Las Vegas. At the time, the Gambino family was the wealthiest and most powerful criminal empire on earth. The family was making over $600 billion per year, larger than every major company in the United States combined. He had billions of dollars and kept to himself in his mansion. Despite all of this wealth, he told his men that the punishment for dealing drugs in the Gambino family was death. John Gotti would later become very famous for rebelling against the order not to sell heroin and cocaine, but more on Gotti later. When Gambino's son married Tommy Lucchese's daughter in 1962, more than 1,000 people attended the wedding. Tommy Lucchese was the don of the Lucchese family. Gambino was well liked across most of the underworld with a few very notable exceptions. Bonanno family associates. I'll discuss more about this in the Bonanno video, but the commission, led by Gambino, had decided that Joe Bonanno was too power-hungry and replaced him with Gaspar Di Gregorio. Bonanno refused this decision, which led to the banana split controversy. Joseph Colombo. More on this in the Colombo video, but it is often theorized that Gambino ordered his assassination. Vito Genovese, after he found out that Gambino had planned to double-cross him, and Tommy Eboli, Genovese's problematic acting boss in the mid-1960s. He had borrowed too much money from Gambino and couldn't repay his debt, and also got in the way of Gambino's appointment of Alphonse Thierry in Eboli's place for a drug trafficking organization. Gambino was cool-headed, collected, and cunning. He never had an attempt on his life. He was also known for never showing his anger. That didn't mean he wasn't ruthless. There was once a soldier in the Colombo family, Dominic Sciallo, who was drunk and disrespectful to Gambino in public. Gambino did nothing, but Sciallo's body was later found at Otto's Social Club in South Brooklyn, encased in the cement floor. Now maybe this interaction with Gambino was just a coincidence. Sciallo was known for being disrespectful, especially when drunk, even insulting Sonny Francis of the Colombo family, which would have been ill-advised to say the least. When Tommy Lucchese died, Carlo Gambino is said to have arranged the entire funeral. He frequently met and spoke with Frank Costello. He gave the eulogy at Lucky Luciano's funeral. By the 1970s, Carlo Gambino was under constant FBI surveillance. Fortunately for Gambino, he knew how to be silent and communicate with nodding and facial expressions. He was never caught. By 1974, due to poor health and being constantly monitored, his cousin and brother-in-law, Paul Castellano, was put into the position of acting boss. Paul Castellano and Agnello Della Croce, John Gotti's mentor, were Gambino's two underbosses at the end of his life. Having two underbosses is like having two heirs to the throne under an ailing king. Della Croce was imprisoned for tax evasion at the time, and Gambino felt that it would be best to take the family in a more legitimate-centric direction, under the leadership of Paul Castellano, who was more business-minded. When Gambino chose Paul Castellano as his successor, there was much controversy. Carlo Gambino died of a heart attack on October 15, 1976, while watching the New York Yankees, he was a fan, at his home. He was buried in the famous St. John Cemetery in Queens, New York. Paul Castellano would take over as boss following Gambino's death. He kept Della Croce in the position of underboss after his official succession in November of 1976. Della Croce accepted his position as Castellano's underboss, but Gambino's decision to make Castellano boss split the family. Constantino Paul Castellano was born on June 26, 1915, in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. Fun fact, Paul Castellano actually signed his name as C. Paul Castellano because he hated the name Constantino that much. He dropped out of school by 8th grade to be a butcher and collected numbers game receipts for the mob. In case you were wondering, the numbers game was a very popular illegal lottery that was played in a number of cities in the United States by working class families and communities. Standing at a whopping 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighing over 300 pounds, it was no surprise that Paul Castellano came to be known as Big Paul. When Castellano was 19, he was arrested for robbing a haberdasher with 2 accomplices. When he refused to give up his accomplices and lived into the tradition of omerta, he earned a reputation for mob loyalty. Castellano's sister Catherine married Carlo Gambino in 1926. Castellano started working in Vincent Mangano's family and would be promoted to capo under Anastasia. Paul Castellano was one of the men arrested in the Appalachian meeting in 1957. On January 13, 1960, Castellano was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but the decision was overturned by the appeals court in November. Castellano did not let his butchering roots go to waste. He launched Dial Poultry, a poultry distribution business, and extorted many of the New York City store owners to buy their poultry from Dial. He later diversified into construction concrete in Staten Island and dominated the industry. Castellano got kickbacks from the Concrete Club, who were contractors that worked for the commission and dealt in multi-million-dollar contracts and always gave a 2% kickback to the commission. Paul Castellano was always known more as a businessman than a mobster or criminal. He even cut a deal with the Westies, an Irish mafia gang. Castellano wanted hitmen who could not be tied back to him, and the Westies wanted Gambino protection from the other Cosa Nostra families. The Gambino-Westies deal was made in February of 1978. Although Big Paul Castellano had this reputation for being business-minded, he was by no means a gentle giant. In 1975, Castellano allegedly ordered the murder of Vito Borelli, his daughter's boyfriend at the time, because he had heard Borelli had compared him to Frank Perdue of Perdue Farms, a poultry distribution rival. In 1978, Castellano ordered the murder of Nicholas Scabetta, a family associate, since he had insulted Capo George DeCicco's daughter and gotten into so many public fights. Now, as you may recall, someone who is made in the mafia is sworn to respect the women involved in their fellow mafiosi's life. However, Scabetta was only an associate, but Castellano was ruthless. Scabetta was the brother-in-law of Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano, and when Gravano caught word that this hit was happening, he said that he would kill Castellano, but DeCicco talked him down, and Gravano decided that Scabetta's punishment was warranted by his behavior. In that same year, Castellano allegedly ordered the murder of his own capo and that capo's son. James Ippolito had complained to Castellano that Anthony Gaggi, another one of Castellano's own capos, was encroaching on his territory. Ippolito asked for permission to kill Gaggi, and Castellano agreed. However, Castellano warned Gaggi, and Gaggi sent his hitman and protege Roy DeMeo to murder James Ippolito Sr. and his son, James Ippolito Jr. In September of 1980, Paul Castellano ordered the murder of his former son-in-law Frank Amato when he found out that Amato was physically abusing his daughter when the two were married. Soldier Roy DeMeo made the hit, cutting up Amato's body and throwing the remains into the sea. Roy DeMeo was involved in more than 200 homicides, and soon the FBI caught on. He was subpoenaed multiple times for racketeering, and the FBI was pursuing and pressuring him, and many feared that he would make a plea deal to avoid the extensive sentencing. In 1983, Castellano allegedly ordered the hit on DeMeo, who was found shot to death in the trunk of his own automobile. In March of 1983, the FBI was able to get a warrant to bug Castellano's lavish home, and they did. Speaking of Castellano's lavish home and lavish lifestyle, many of his associates and members of the Gambino family felt that Big Paul Castellano was getting a little too big for his britches. He had become a recluse, conducting business out of his White House-like mansion and wearing silk and satin dressing gowns and velvet slippers. He had lost touch with the men on the street. Once his mansion was bugged, Castellano had several legal issues. On March 30th, 1984, Paul Castellano was released on a $2 million bail for federal indictment charges and the Ippolito and DeMeo murders. On February 25th, 1985, Castellano was released on a $3 million bail after being arrested for racketeering, which resulted in the Mafia Commission trial, which lasted into November of 1986, where 11 mafiosi were put on trial, including the heads of the 5 families, and were indicted by U.S. Attorney Rudolph Giuliani under the RICO, Racketeering, Influence, and Corrupt Organizations Act. I will be covering the Mafia Commission trial and RICO Act in another video. That is a super interesting topic that I'm very excited to get into. But right now, let's stay focused on the Gambino family. On July 1st, 1985, Castellano was indicted on loan sharking and tax evasion. He pleaded not guilty. On November 4th, 1985, he was named as head of a huge stolen car ring and was connected to 5 murders. The beginning of the end for Paul Castellano was when Agnello Della Croce died of cancer on December 2nd, 1985. Paul Castellano did not attend his underboss's wake, thus insulting the family. After Della Croce's death, Castellano did not promote a capo to the underboss position, as was the custom, but instead placed his loan shark bodyguard Thomas Bellotti as the new underboss. And to add salt to the wound, threatened to disband John Gotti's gang, which Gotti had operated under Della Croce's leadership. John Gotti and Salvatore Gravano, originally involved with the Colombo family but now working with the Gambinos, had conspired to kill Paul Castellano and succeeded on December 16, 1985 at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. John Gotti did not want to take any chances. There were hitmen posted at the entrance of the steakhouse and another wave of hitmen down the street. From his vehicle across the street, John Gotti watched the murder of Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti, who had driven Castellano to the steakhouse. After the two had been gunned down at the entrance, Gotti drove over to take a look at the bodies for himself, then 2 weeks later, took over as the Gambino family head. Once John Gotti was made boss, he established his man Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano as his underboss. I will cover John Gotti's life in a completely separate video. In fact, I'll be covering Carlo Gambino, Paul Castellano, and John Gotti in their own videos. The Gambino family had quite the star-studded cast of godfathers. John Joseph Gotti Jr., the Teflon Don, Johnny Boy, Crazy Horse, Black John, the Dapper Don, was born on October 27, 1940 into poverty in the South Bronx in New York City. He was the 5th of 13 children born to Italian immigrants. If you know anything about John Gotti, it probably comes as no surprise to you that he was a middle child. Gotti got into crime by running errands for Carmine Fatico. He would befriend future godfather of the Bonanno family, Joseph Massino, when they hijacked cars together. It was while working under Fatico that Massino gave Gotti the nicknames Black John and Crazy Horse. Gotti would later meet Agnello Della Croce, who would become his mentor. Della Croce's talk of the golden days of the Mafia and the power of Albert Anastasia made Gotti idolize Anastasia. In school, Gotti was in trouble often for bullying and truancy. Gotti dropped out of high school at 16 to pursue the life and started his own street gang in the Queens under Della Croce called the Fulton Rockaway Boys. Gotti had arrests for petty crimes such as car theft, street fights, etc. etc. In 1968, however, he, Gene Gotti, his brother, and Angelo Ruggiero were arrested by the FBI for committing cargo thefts worth thousands of dollars and truck hijacking near the JFK airport. They all pled guilty to reduced counts. They were also in trouble for cigarette theft, but that charge was dropped. Gotti served 3 years, and when he got out in 1971, Carmine Fatico put him in charge of the family's illegal gambling operations. Carmine Fatico was arrested the next year on loan sharking charges, and as a condition of release, could not associate with known felons like Gotti. At this point, Gotti was not yet a made man, but Fatico named him acting capo after he was paroled. Gotti and underboss Agnello Della Croce grew very close at this time. In addition to racketeering, hijacking, loan sharking, bookmaking, prostitution, extortion, pornography, and illegal gambling, John Gotti was also involved in the drug trade, which Agnello and Fatico overlooked, but boss Paul Castellano did not appreciate. When Della Croce died, and Don Paul Castellano did not attend the funeral, placed his bodyguard as underboss, and threatened to break up Gotti's gang, Gotti had Castellano killed and took over as boss. In his heyday, John Gotti was the most powerful boss in Cosa Nostra, and he let everyone know it. The Dapper Don always had his hair styled, wore suits worth thousands, and engaged with the media. "This is my public," he said. "They love me." The Gambino family under Gotti was earning about $500 million per year, with Gotti himself earning about $10 million a year in cash, and according to Salvatore Gravano, earned $1 million of that just from the construction industry extortion alone. So you've probably heard of John Gotti as the Teflon Don, or you've maybe heard that phrase before. So how did John Gotti get the name of Teflon Don? Well, allow me to explain. As Gotti had inherited Castellano's Gambino Westies deal when he became the Don, it helped him get off the hook for intimidation charges from Romuald Piecyk in March of 1986, who, when called to the stand, after being harassed and threatened by phone calls and having his brakes cut, said he was unable to identify who it was that had intimidated him. The case was dismissed. The media dubbed this "I for Gotti." On April 13, 1986, Gotti avoided death by car bomb under the orders of Vincent Gigante to avenge Castellano's death. In August of 1986, when Gotti was being charged for racketeering, the case was acquitted on March 13, 1987, due to issues with jury selection and jury tampering. All of this gave rise to the nickname Teflon Don. The FBI was able to obtain copious records of Gotti in the apartment above his social club. In addition to the recordings, the FBI got Gotti's underboss Salvatore "Sammy the Bull" Gravano to flip and testify against him. By December of 1990, they had their man. On the day of Gotti's conviction, New York FBI office head James Fox said, "The Teflon is gone. The Don is covered in Velcro," and all the charges stuck. In 1992, Gotti was convicted of 13 counts, including loan sharking, racketeering, murder, jury tampering, and illegal gambling. Gotti was sentenced to life in prison. From 1992 to 1999, John Gotti's son, John Angelo Jr. Gotti, was acting boss of the family, but he was in prison for racketeering himself in 1999. From 1999 to 2002, Peter Gotti, John's brother, took over as acting boss of the family. John Gotti died on June 10, 2002 of throat cancer. When he was laid to rest, his admirers gathered by the hundreds. They tossed roses onto the Cadillac hearse that drove his body and held signs saying "John Gotti forever." A motorcade of 75 limousines, 19 of which were flower cars, drove through Queens, past Gotti's home, and Ozone Park, where Gotti made a name for himself in the Mafia. He was buried at St. John's Cemetery in Middle Village. Peter Gotti, who was referred to as the dumbest Don when he took over as acting boss, ended up being the official family head from 2002 to 2011. He was arrested a few days after taking control and worked through acting bosses himself. In 2002, Arnold Scitieri took over as acting boss, but was arrested in 2005 for extortion. Nicholas Caruso took over as acting boss from 2005 to 2008 until he surrendered to the FBI after being on the run for illegal gambling, murder, and racketeering charges. He was even featured on America's Most Wanted. He was sentenced to 13.5 years in federal prison. Peter Gotti is expected to be released from prison in 2032, when he will be in his 90s. There is some debate as to whether or not Domenico Cefalù took over as boss or acting boss in 2011. It is widely believed that Peter Gotti still runs the family. Cefalù ran the family in a much more traditional Cosa Nostra style from 2011 to 2015. His role as acting or official boss would mark the end of the Gotti era. From 2015 to 2019, it was widely believed that Frank Colli took over the role as boss or acting boss from an aging Cefalù. It is unclear as to whether or not he really was the Gambino head. It was reported in July of 2013 that he had rejected the offer to become boss. He was shot to death on March 13, 2019. The official leadership of the Gambino family remains murky to this day. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Racket Reviews, wrapping up our discussion about the Gambino family. I have so much more to tell you, so much more to cover, and so much that I had to skip that I'm just going to have to cover in other videos or the individual videos of the flagship Dons themselves. Make sure to like, subscribe, and click notifications to get more Mafia content sent directly to your sub box. Ciao.